Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to be going over the most terrifying ghost stories from around the web. We are currently on Volume 2 of this series. If you enjoy this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Now, let's get into the fearful findings. This is a story I do not often tell. I promise, sincerely, that this has scarred me for life, and although I have looked into psychological explanations for what I heard and natural explanations for what occurred, they remain unsatisfactory. When I was a child, I was scared of the dark. I swore to my mother that I heard voices in it. They were not evil, but they were not familiar, and so they scared me. It was not uncommon in the middle of the night for me to wake up and hear whispers, as I would call them when asking my mom. She figured they were just bumps in the night, and typical kid nightmare material. I tried often to explain to her that it was more than that they sounded different from one another the way people's voices do. On some nights, I would get so scared from these whispers that I would sleep in my mom's bed with her. It was an added bonus that the bathroom was directly outside of her bedroom door for my late night tinkles. I should add at this point that when walking out into the hall to go to the bathroom, you look directly down the stairs that would lead you into my living room on the first floor, as my mom's bedroom was on the second floor. On one such night, around Christmas, I awoke and felt the need to relieve myself. I walked out at the door and distinctly heard the phrase, "Look," and, to my astonishment, a red light, almost like a spotlight, was cast upon the wall at the very bottom of the stairs. The light had no other source, it was by itself, and I was transfixed by it. Being a little kid, and it only being a few days from Christmas, I knew what this light was. It was Santa. How else could he get into my house to know I was being a good boy? I was so excited that I began walking down the stairs to greet him, picking up my pace after the second step as it began to creep off the wall and fade into the darkness in my living room. That's when I heard him. A very strong, masculine voice. Different from the first. Not at all like my father's. Not to say he isn't masculine. It was just distinctly different. It said, "Stop. Right now. Go back up those stairs." I listened, turned around, and what happened next? I am not sure I would believe if someone had told me this same story. After reaching the top of the stairs, I heard a very loud crash that sent me running back to my mother's bed, where I jumped straight under the covers and stayed there the whole night. When we awoke the next morning, the poinsettia lights, little Christmas flower lights that glowed red, my mother had put on the railing down the stairs were pulled straight down to the bottom of the stairs, some broken from what seemed like a forceful tear. Laying in a single pile, the dry sink in my living room had fallen from the wall. My mother could not explain it. My father was worried we had been the victims of a home invasion. My sister was crying. There was nothing missing. Nobody had broken in, and there did not seem to be any reason this had happened. And then I saw it, and I kept quiet about it because I was so afraid that I could not force words out of my mouth. There, on the edge of the wooden dry sink, which had been facing up, were 3 indentations where the finish on the wood had been worn, almost as if in a forceful grip. Something down there had grabbed it and threw it down. That was what the bang was. I was mortified. After that day, I never heard a single voice again. I do not like to imagine what was waiting downstairs for me that night, if it was anything at all, but I can tell you that the reality was that something had physically acted upon 2 things in my house near the bottom of that stairwell. After this, I never heard another whisper again. Which is sad, because in some ways I would have liked to thank the man, masculine energy, who had stopped me from going down those stairs. This happened when I was 7 or 7.5, as I liked to say at the time. I am 20 years old now, and because of this incident, I am still afraid of the dark, especially shadowy stairwells. Disclaimer, I submitted this in the past. All events are true. My house was built in 1904. It is a single-family home with a wood frame set on a concrete block foundation. I have been living here for about 12 years. Of all the weird things that my siblings and I have seen or heard in this house, this one event is my favorite. This happened to my brother. About 10 years ago, my brother and his best friend started a garage band playing mostly Spanish rock, or alternative music, but in Spanish. His friends could only get together on Sunday afternoons. They would practice into the early evening. They would usually call it quits by 8 p.m. This was the time I usually showed up and went to bed because I worked the graveyard shift. This happened in late fall, so the days were getting shorter. They had just finished a long session when the decision to head to someone else's house came about. My brother handed his car keys to his buddy so they could load up the equipment. Everyone had filed out of the basement. The tricky part was that they needed to walk all the way to the back of the basement, up the back stairs, to the kitchen doorway, down the hall, into the living room, and out into the front porch. Everyone was outside, sitting in my brother's truck, waiting for him. My brother was walking up the back stairs when he remembered that he had left his pancakes in a to-go container sitting on a speaker in the basement. He made the decision to go back. Now the basement is not clean. With full sight lines, there have been partitions made, and the boiler and main heating unit are right smack in the middle. So after my brother walks back, he is about to retrieve his food container when, out of the corner of his eye, he sees it. It is a shadowy figure. Right in his peripheral vision, this feeling of dread and uneasiness washed over my brother. We had been taught that if you are in the presence of a spirit or ghost and you feel a bad vibe, you should say a quick prayer or cuss at it. My brother chose the latter. He basically just said, "Hey, fuck you. I don't have time for this shit." My brother started to walk to the back of the basement and briskly up the stairs, closing doors and turning off lights as he was walking out. The last light switch was on the opposite side of the front door. Luckily, the door was open, and the light from the street lamp was flooding the living room with its amber light. My brother said he felt something at his back, but at no point did he turn around. As he flicked the last switch, the living room went dark, as did the rest of the house. As he stepped out, he pulled on the door, closing it behind him. Still holding his food container in one hand, he jogged down the few porch steps and walked towards the front gate. Our house resides far from the main street, essentially having a large front yard but no rear garage. As he closed the gap between himself and his friend-laden truck, he kind of smiled and thought things over in his head, mad at himself for spooking out when there was no reason. He climbed into the driver's side of the truck, putting on his seatbelt and getting ready to pull out of the parking spot directly in front of the house, when one of his friends asked, "Hey, wait, what about your brother? Isn't he coming with us?" My brother answered, "What do you mean? He went to work early tonight. He is already gone. Do you see his car anywhere?" The next question they asked was, "So then who was walking behind you when you were leaving the house?" My friend and a few of his college buddies were going on a ghost hunt and had heard about some graveyards where children murdered by their mothers had been buried. The graveyard was located off the main road, so my friend parked his car on the side of the road, and the group, 5 to 7 people, I believe, got out and followed the small path through the woods for a couple minutes to get to the graveyard. Once there, nothing exciting happened for the first 10 minutes or so, and they had tried everything the website or wherever they heard the story told them to do, with nothing resulting. They got bored, and being typical inebriated college kids, they started taunting the supposed ghost of the mother. This continued for a few minutes before they tired and decided to go back to the car as one of the girls had to go to the bathroom. Once they got back to the car, my friend, the sober driver, tried opening the handle without unlocking the car because he hadn't locked it in the first place, but found it locked. He attributed this to bad memory at the time. The group drove home, laughing and talking like normal. After he had dropped all the others off at their homes, he went back to his own house. He got in at the same time as one of his roommates, who stopped and waited for him to pull in. The roommate had his phone out and shined the light in the window when his friend pulled in as a joke. What he saw were tiny, baby-sized handprints all over the windows. As soon as my friend got out, he went into the house without saying a word to the roommate. The roommate, confused, went back to the car and tried to rub one of the handprints. They were on the inside of the window. To this day, my friend will not speak of his drive home after he dropped off his other friends and has since sold the car without ever driving it again. My own story. This one is from my own experience. I was driving home with a friend from a tournament we had gone to about 2 to 3 hours away. The whole weekend, it had been raining and storming very hard, and a lot of roads were flooded. This was Indiana, so a bunch of side roads and bridges were just gone. We had to reroute around 231, since a huge section of it was underwater from where a river had flooded. We ended up going through a few side towns and back roads that were a lot higher, away from other bodies of water. We were driving through one small town, and I was navigating with the GPS in the car. I would glance at it every once in a while, but I was also paying attention to what was going on outside the car, as it was still raining pretty heavily. The GPS directed us on a road that connected up with a more main one. and we were driving on it just fine when suddenly, my buddy slammed on the brakes. We're in the middle of a graveyard, and the road just ends. I look down at the GPS and then show my buddy that the road continues straight on and straight back the way we came, according to the GPS screen. He shrugs, turns around, and then we start back the way we came. Now, we had been telling ghost stories, and I was not at all sleepy or tired. We had driven on the one road the last 15 miles or so, directly through the town and on into the countryside, before we encountered the graveyard. On the way back, we made 5 to 6 turns within this graveyard, through which we had just come on a straight road that also suddenly spanned back a mile or so, before finally getting back onto the straight road we thought we were on before. I looked at the GPS again, and it was rerouting. When it finished, the route it wanted us to take was make a U-turn and continue on County Road 200N for 10 miles. We both turned around in our seats to confirm that we had indeed just driven through a huge graveyard, with many turns and twists in the road leading back into it. Instead, we saw the road dead-ended into a small graveyard. We immediately drove back to the town in the opposite direction of the graveyard and took a different route home. When I was a kid in the suburbs of Chicago, adventure meant Quetico Provincial Park, up on the border of Minnesota and Canada. The name implies that the place was small, but Quetico is a million-acre nature preserve, so big that you could go days and days without seeing another soul. We would go on camping trips up there, weeks of canoeing and portaging, seeing bears, moose, and deer, sleeping under star-soaked skies. The park was isolated and so pristine that you can actually drink the water straight from the lakes. But I won't be going back to Quetico anytime soon. Not after what happened to a girl named Frances Brandywine. Frances was 17 at the time, black-haired and with a reckless nature, determined always to leave the well-trod path, to break new ground, and to be alone. A few years ago, Frances was up in Quetico with her family. They were in a remote part of the park, camped on the shore of one of the deeper lakes, a lonely body of water carved millions of years ago by a passing glacier. The deep part of this particular lake was rumored to be about 300 feet. One night, after her family went to bed, Frances took the rowboat out, planning to find a quiet spot in the middle of the lake, lay on the bench of the boat, look up at the sky, and maybe write in her journal. So she left the shore, rowed for about 20 minutes, and when she felt satisfied that she was over the lake's deepest spot, she lay down on the bench and looked up at the night sky. The stars were very bright, and the aurora borealis was shimmering like a neon lasso. She was feeling very peaceful. Then she heard something strange. It was like a knock. Clop, clop. She sat up, guessing that the boat had drifted to shore and run aground. But she looked around the boat, and she was still a half-mile from shore. She leaned over the side to see if she'd hit anything, but she saw nothing, no log, no rocks. She lay back down. She told herself it could be any number of things, a fish, a turtle, or a stick that had drifted under the boat. She relaxed again and soon fell into a contented reverie. She had just closed her eyes when she heard another knock. This time it was louder, a crisp plop, 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 like the sound of someone knocking hard on a wooden door, except this knocking was coming from the bottom of the boat. Now she was scared. She leaned over the side again. It had to be an animal. But what kind of animal would knock like that? 3 quick, loud knocks in rapid succession. Her mouth went dry. She held on to each side of the boat, and now she could only wait to see if it happened again. The silence stretched out. A few minutes passed, and just as she began to think she'd imagined it all, the knocks came again, but this time louder. Bam, bam, bam. She had to leave. She lunged for the oars. She got them in place and began rowing. The water was very calm, so she should have made quick progress. But after rowing feverishly, she looked around, and she realized that she wasn't moving at all. Something was keeping her exactly where she was. Again, she tried rowing. She rowed and rowed on the verge of tears, but she went nowhere. She stopped. She was exhausted. Her heavy breathing filled the air. She cried. She sobbed. But soon she calmed herself again, and the boat was silent again for 10 minutes, then 20. Again, she tricked herself into thinking she'd imagined it all. But just like before, just when she was beginning to get a grip on herself, the knocking came again, this time as loud as a bass drum. Boom, boom, boom. The floorboards of the boat shook with each knock. Now that she was so shaken, she started making questionable decisions. The first was to lower one of the oars into the black water, trying to feel if there was some landmass or even some creature she could touch. As soon as the oar broke the water's surface, though, she felt a strong, silent tug at the other end, and the oar was pulled under. She screamed, she jumped back, and now she had no options. All she could do was sit, pope, and wait for the morning to come, wait for whatever was going to happen to happen. The knocking went on through the night. She passed the time writing in her notebook, and it's only because of this notebook that we know what happened that night. Frances can't tell us. She was never seen again. The boat was found on shore the next day, empty, but for the journal. On those pages were her frantic jottings, all written in her distinctive handwriting, all but the last page. When the journal was found, that page was still wet, and on it were 4 words, looking as if they'd been written quickly, with a muddy finger. They said, "I did knock first." True story. My brother once lived in a flat in the downtown of Mt. Clemens, Michigan. The Clem was known to be a hotspot for bads back in the Depression era and was booming with activity. Nowadays, it has some rundown parts. This is where my brother rented his flat. It was a giant old raggedy house that was now separated into multiple odd apartments. Anyways, long story short, he always admitted to odd experiences, cabinet doors opening up, things missing, but one peculiar oddity was that he was always missing boxers and underwear from his drawer. He admitted that he thought his house was haunted and that the ghost had a crush on him. Never anything violent or disturbing, just odd things. Later on, he starts dating his future ex-wife. She starts coming around, and he notices that the oddities begin to increase. New oddities began to occur. His girlfriend would always find her shoes, which were left on a mat inside the apartment, outside the door on the patio in the morning. She'd always tell my brother to stop putting her shoes outside. He had an idea of why, but didn't want to frighten her. Besides, it wasn't hurting anyone, right? Well, things started getting worse. He comes home from work, and his girlfriend, who was staying there while he was gone, claims that the stove burner kept lighting itself. She'd walk into the kitchen, and it would be lit. She'd turn it off, and shortly later it'd be lit again. Then, one night, my brother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees his girlfriend sitting at the end of the bed. He not only sees but also feels her near his feet, staring at him. He calls out for her to come back to bed, but she doesn't respond, so he calls out louder, telling her to come to bed and asking what's wrong. His girlfriend then asks what he's doing. He turns, and she's sleeping next to him. He turns back. No one is at the end of the bed. Now, he's freaked out but doesn't want to scare his girlfriend from coming over to his place. A few nights later, they're both sleeping, and he wakes up to his girlfriend screaming. He looks over, and she's sleeping but thrashing around, holding onto her neck. He doesn't see anything, so he starts yelling and shaking her to wake her up. After a few shakes, she wakes up crying and terrified. She starts telling my brother about how real her dream felt, that a woman was strangling her, telling her to get out, that she doesn't belong there, and to leave her man alone. Her neck had red marks on it, possibly from herself trying to defend herself, but they believed it to be from something else. My brother then comes clean with her, and they decide to do some research and find out that the address that they live in was an old brothel back in the day that the rich baiters used to stay in. My brother lived in that house for a few more weeks before he could locate a new place. She never came back to stay the night, and he never experienced anything aggressive while there. Still, kinda fucked up though. I know my brother, and I can tell when he's lying. This shit was legit, and when she talked about it, you could see how shaken up she was. Edit. Second story added. Alright, so I used to date this girl whose family told me about this. I'll try to make this quick. LSS, she tells me that when she was a little girl, she woke up at night to see this old man who was literally on fire and staring at her in her room. She freaked out and hid under the covers, yelling for her parents. When her parents rushed in, they saw nothing. She refused to sleep in her room, so her parents changed her room, and that was the last of them. Her parents convinced her it was a nightmare, and eventually she believed that was all it was. Fast forward, when she moved out of college, her parents called her and told her that her little brother, now sleeping in that room, had exactly the same thing happen to him. They said that they never spoke of the nightmare after it happened to her because they believed that was all it was. They also knew how terrified she was, so they would hope that she'd forget about it. Therefore, there was no way that her brother could have just repeated what he heard. When I was dating her, her brother was a teenager, and they both talked about what they saw and claimed they saw the exact same thing, detail for detail. The parents were pretty freaked out about it. Still, no one knows what the hell it was or why it was there. Creepy, man. Not heard, but experienced. I was on a college ghost hunt with a guy named Chris Fleming. Cool dude. We did all the normal college ghost hunt stuff, walking to supposedly haunted dorms and experiencing some cool stuff, but nothing crazy. The city we were in had this special place called the Ghost Trestle. It was basically a railroad bridge in the middle of a cornfield that had a dirt road underneath it. Anyway, during the ghost hunt with this guy, who was actually featured on Ghost Adventures, we told him about this place. He was pumped and rushed through the rest of the college ghost hunt. He, his assistant, and a few of my friends took 2 cars with all his equipment to this Ghost Trestle. When we got there, a train was coming, so he interviewed us on camera to tell the story about this place. The story: back a long time ago, there was a farmhouse, still there but rebuilt, and a farmer, his wife, and his son escaped a fire in the house. Also on fire were the horse stables. The farmer ran in to try and rescue the horse before they succumbed to the fire, while the wife and son went away down a train that was passing by. The story ends with the farmer dying in the stable fire, and as the wife and child were waving down the train, they were struck and killed. To this day, if you park your car under the bridge while a train crosses you above, it is supposed to open up another dimensional world to be able to communicate. Well, we show up, and of course, to our luck, there is a train coming. We all freaked out and got pumped while the medium, Chris Fleming, attempted to communicate. We were all taking pictures and began to experience weird technological failures. My camera, which was my own, began flashing and taking multiple pictures. The same thing was occurring with our disposable camera, which Chris Fleming's assistant had. At one point, we began to see stuff mostly out of the corner of our eyes, and Chris attempted to communicate, but whatever spirit was there seemed more intimidated. He, Chris, believed it to be the spirit of the little boy. We would every now and then see a figure poking its head out from behind a concrete wall under the tracks. It seemed like it was playing hide and seek. That's when I snapped an image. The picture is not large enough to see, but if you are able to get a larger size, you can see a bright ball of light and mist surrounding it when zooming in close. I can honestly say that I was young and thought this stuff was a hoax and just fun for college kids to pretend. Until this night, when we had a real professional experience, we all did the same thing. Fast forward to a year or 2 after this event. I came to this same place for the first time since the night we went with Chris Fleming. This time it was just me and my then GF. I parked under the bridge, turned off the car and lights, and took the key out of the ignition. We were joking together about how we were getting too old for this stuff. And when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw a black shadow flash by the rear window of my car, followed by some noises that sounded like someone was running towards my car. My heart never raced so fast to put my key into the ignition, peel it out, and get out of there. Whatever it was, it didn't seem like it wanted us there, and I have yet to drive under or by the bridge since. Not a ghost story, but a creepy story one of my buddies once told me. Here's a little context for the story. I played football with this guy in college who served in the Air Force, and he used to run security details for bases, all-night jobbies where he and his squad mate would drive around in Humvees all night searching the perimeter of the base. It was a Saturday night when I heard this story, and we were all quite drunk at the time, so bear with me in my memory. It was one night, and Matt, my friend, and his squad mate, let's call him Craig, were doing an average patrol, driving through these Kansas plains, searching the area around their base. I remember Matt telling me how out in Kansas, there were tons of old abandoned houses that were left during the Dust Bowl and other problems. Seeing an abandoned house was a normal occurrence for these guys, so they never thought anything of it. But it was this particular night that Matt's squad mate, Craig, was feeling adventurous and wanted to check one out. After a few minutes, they found this old abandoned house planted in the middle of the fields and drove up to it. As they got out, Matt told us he had a very bad feeling about it. Just one of those feelings deep in the pit of your stomach that you don't like, you know? He said to us, and we all knew what he was talking about. Naturally, Matt went against this gut feeling and jumped out of the Humvee with Craig, who, if I remember correctly, was extremely eager about this whole situation and scoping out this old house in the middle of bumblefuck nowhere. They parked about 30 meters from the house, he said, and slowly approached it, lit only by moonlight. As they got closer, Matt said that the feeling in his stomach began to get worse and worse, yet he still ignored it. The two walked up to the door, porch creaking and all. Matt said that Craig was on point, as he suggested the idea. As the two approached the door, they knocked, and to everyone's surprise, there was no answer. The two proceeded to enter the house and began to look around. Matt said he felt uneasy, so at this point he raised his standard issue rifle and began to tactically clear this abandoned house. The one thing that Matt said stood out was that the house was completely intact on the inside, and it looked like the previous owners had just up and left one day, leaving everything behind. The table was still set and all. Upon seeing this, Matt began to feel uneasy. As the two proceeded through the house looking around, Craig suggested they go upstairs to see what was up there, but Matt was to take the lead, which, feeling uneasy about, he did. He said that as he crept up the stairs with his weapon shouldered, it began to get colder and colder. Keep in mind, it's the middle of August, so it's hotter than two rats fucking in a wool sock outside. But it began to get chilly, like creepy chilly, Matt told us. As he entered the first room he came upon, he noticed something odd. Two beds were laid out in what looked like a little girl's room. What Matt told us then has stuck with me since that fall night. Matt told us that what pushed him over the edge to leave the house was that there were clothes laid out on the bed as they were set up for school the next morning, but that morning never came. At this point, Matt wanted to get the fuck out of the house, yet Craig was still feeling adventurous. As the two were about to exit this house, Craig spotted the basement door, slightly cracked yet not fully ajar. And Matt told us he saw a glimmer in his eyes, like that, "Oh, we're definitely doing this, look." Matt wasn't having any of this, so he told Craig to take point. Craig eagerly did. Craig began to crack the door open, still with his weapon and flashlight on, and began to proceed down the stairs. Matt is only a few steps behind him, but suddenly, as Craig reached the bottom of the steps, he turned a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Matt, still behind the corner, not knowing what was behind it, asked Craig, "Well, what's down here?" Not a word from Craig. Matt turned around to look at Craig and noticed his face had turned ghost white, with a 1,000-yard stare on his face. And Craig proceeded to push Matt out of the way, nonchalantly walking up the stairs and walking out of the house, not looking back. Matt followed behind him, not looking around the corner. As the two got back in the vehicle, Craig said not one word for the rest of their shift. Nothing. No matter how many times he asked him what he saw, Craig said nothing. To this day, Craig will still never talk about what he saw when he turned that corner, and he's the only one who knows what was in that basement. Matt told us that whenever it is brought up, Craig turns that ghost white and quietly sits there with a blank look. I'm sorry for all of the grammar issues, guys, but it's 1:45 a.m., and I'm really tired. I just hope this doesn't get buried. It took me a while to write this out. Here's another anecdote that I originally posted with an old username. The story itself is a few months old now, but I copied and pasted the text, so it is still written as if it just happened several days ago. My grandmother is in a nursing home after suffering a stroke a few months ago. Mentally, she is all there. However, her one side is partially paralyzed and she is in rehab in the nursing home. She's been weakened by the relative lack of activity, though. On Sunday, as we were getting ready to go visit her first thing in the morning, as we always do, we got a call from the family of her old best friend. The friend had moved to Florida about 10 years ago, and they had gradually lost touch, save for a Christmas card every now and then. Well, the friend had just died very early that morning, and they were calling to inform us of her death. When we got to the nursing home, we signed in and noticed we were the first visitors of the day. We went to my grandmother's room and said hi. We also have a visitor's book for people to sign in her room, so we know who has visited her. Nobody has signed it since Saturday morning. As we walked into her room, she exclaimed, "Oh my, so many visitors this morning." We asked what she meant. She replied that she had gotten a visit from an old, dear friend that morning. It was the friend from Florida who had just passed away. She had told my grandmother that she was going away for a while, not to worry, that she would be watching out for her, and that they would see each other again. My grandmother also remarked on how healthy she looked. I've never had chills run down my spine like that before. Later, I asked if anyone had been to my grandmother's room that morning, and the staff said no. We asked if any phone calls had come through for her that morning, and they again said no. They also logged phone calls for residents, and when they checked the logs, there was nothing that they had forgotten. I also called the family of the friend in Florida this morning to offer my condolences and ask if they had called anyone else around here. I asked under the guise that I would help notify people around here, so I didn't want to double call people. They said we were the only ones they had called from around here, and the only reason they called us was because they thought my grandmother still lived with us. They had no idea until I told them this morning that she was in a nursing home. I know it's in the realm of reality that she could have simply dreamed it, but the chances of her having a dream like that with that sort of message on the very morning that her friend died are so remote that it still gives me chills. TLDR. My grandmother's friend died, and about the time she died, my grandmother saw a vision of her saying goodbye, even though my grandmother had no idea her friend had passed. A little backstory. Where I used to live in Pennsylvania, there was a building just down the hill from where I used to live. We lived on a hill, so to speak. Maybe 400 yards from the bottom of the first hill, there was a cliff that led down to the river. This building had been a butcher's shop. What else? For decades. The owner was the grandson of the original owner and had moved the shop across town about 2 decades before I was born, circa 1967. For about 10 years after that, it was used as a mechanic's shop due to the unique layout of the building, which was basically a split level and allowed for vehicles to be pulled into the garage from the above street and then serviced from the lower level. In the late 1970s, the mechanic moved to a neighboring town, so the shop nearest was shut down. The building was left unattended for several years until the mid-80s, when a squatter began to live there. He was a homeless man who would do odd jobs for the people who lived in town and around it. It was a fairly concentrated town of 5,000 people, but all in a small area. When you left town, you left town. Everyone called him Ed, and apparently he had done some work for the mechanic's shop and was a World War II vet who hadn't come back from the war in a great mental state. In the early 90s, a group of teenagers began to bother this guy. They'd throw garbage at him, taunt him, and occasionally chase him. Never much more than that until one day when they cornered the poor dude in the upper level of the old shop. One of them began to beat him with an old broomstick. The guy was pushing 70 to begin with and couldn't do much to fight back. A neighbor saw the fight unfold and called the police. Even before the true beating had really started, the police showed up and scared away the teenagers, arresting one for possession, and began to look for Ed to make sure he was okay. They never found him. For a while, everyone just assumed that he had run off, until a resident of one of the buildings near the old shop reported a horrible smell seeping from the lower level, where the old oil pit was, of the shop. There in the mixture of blood and dirt was Ed. Most of the oil had seeped out, I've been told. The body was in a horrible state of decay after being dead for about a month, but it appeared he had sustained a tremendous beating. There was no autopsy performed, and people began to reach out to Ed's family to tell them he had died. They couldn't find any except a woman in her early 90s who supposedly had some relation to Ed. The woman identified Ed as her younger cousin but didn't know much of him beyond that and had only met him once or twice. Ed was buried, and the teenagers were tried for various crimes ranging from accidental death to the aforementioned possession charges. Oddly, they were acquitted for the most part. Only the possession ended up sticking due to the fact that no autopsy had been performed at the time of death and the fact that the teens were all minors, 13 to 15. There was also a mistake in the processing of the individuals, which led to one of the teens being severely beaten at the hands of an adult who may or may not have been a cop at the time. This led to dismissals for everything but possession. Time passed, and the incident was largely forgotten. In the early 2000s, the butcher finally passed away. He was a fairly prominent man in town at this point, as he'd been there for decades, as had his father and grandfather. His son wasn't carrying on the business and decided to hold a memorial for his dad in the old shop. He and a few friends went and began to clean up the place to make room for guests. They had to install a new front door, upper level, as the old one was completely demolished from years of neglect. During this process, they unearthed an old metal container that had been cemented directly into the wall. This container had photographs of the dad and his father, the second-generation butcher, from the 1950s, when they began to work together. The son, who would have been a fourth-generation butcher if he followed in his footsteps, decided they would be great for the memorial, so he had a few of them blown up to poster size and displayed a few of them at the memorial. Also included in the box was a diary that hadn't been touched in 40-plus years. The day of the memorial, people began to notice another man showing up from time to time in more than a few of the photos. Sure enough, there was Ed. He had worked for the second-generation butcher for about a decade, right after World War II, and had been present when the third-generation butcher began to run the shop. The son, upon reading his father's diary, learned that they began to have a severe hatred for each other around the mid-60s when his grandfather retired from the shop, and they had gotten into several fights beforehand. The last entry was about the move across town. The third-gen butcher wrote, "I can't take it anymore. We have to leave." This puzzled the son, who began to backtrack and figure out what happened. Apparently, the butcher had gotten into a physical altercation with Ed that resulted in Ed being hit in the back of the head with a cleaver. The butcher wrote, "I can tell no one this, as it will ruin my entire family, but I buried him in the blood pit. The shop will mask the smell, and I don't think anyone will miss him. May God have mercy on my soul." When the auto shop took over, they ended up filling this pit with oil and other debris to drown out the smell of animal blood and parts, and had filled a hole around 6 foot deep. Once the oil had completely seeped through the surrounding soil, it apparently weakened its integrity and allowed the wall to partially collapse, revealing the hideously decayed corpse of Ed. The son decided to speak to the medical examiner, who had seen Ed's body, and began the process of having Ed exhumed. He wanted to either confirm the claim or clear his father's name. The cousin had since died, and no one opposed the exhumation, so they brought up the coffin. The examiner went over the corpse again, and sure enough, he began to see that Ed had died more from sharp force trauma than from any sort of blunt trauma. He also began to analyze the remaining tissue more closely, and noted that it was completely drenched in oil and was far better preserved than it had any right to be. The debris the auto shop had loaded on top of Ed, inadvertently, had basically delayed the decay that he should have been experiencing. The teens had surely been beating somebody that day. The police began to look for the teens to question them. The story unfolded in a grotesque manner. The police report indicated that the teens claimed an elderly man had been following them and had chased them into the old shop. They claimed to be defending themselves and ran away at the first chance they got. There were 4 teens mentioned in the police report. All were now dead. They had all committed suicide in different ways. One had jumped into the river at the nearby dam and drowned. One had hung herself. One had sat in their garage with the car running, and the last had slit his wrists. They all had one thing in common, however. Each had complained of a person following them for years after the beating incident. Occasionally, they would notice someone seemed to follow them home from work or school in the same car day after day, week after week. Sometimes it would be someone at the mall or a creepy person outside their house. Of the 4, only one left any sort of indication of a note after suicide. Scrawled in blood on the bathroom wall beside the corpse of the last person to kill himself were the sloppy yet legible words, "Thank you, Ed." It was later established that this individual likely would not have been able to write this using his own hands, as the blood loss coupled with the damage he had done to his arms would have rendered them both nearly useless. I was at my grandparents' house one night. My grandmother then came into my room at 3:30 in the morning and told me, "Your grandfather needs your help. Get up." This sort of startled me because she has never done anything like this. I go out to where my grandfather is right outside the door that goes into the garage, and he tells me, "The garage door just went up and down 6 or 7 times. We need to check it out." I obviously said all right, and we went into the garage only to find the pull string that prevents the door from opening, which can only be pulled from the inside. He looks at me and says, "We have to go outside to fix it so no one can get in." We then headed outside, and when we rounded the corner to look at the garage, the motion lights came on, and there seemed to be scratches on the door. He and I fixed the door and went back to bed. About 2 weeks after this, I was staying there again and woke up at around 2:30 in the morning to hear stomping in the kitchen, which is very close to my room. I get up and hear the stomps come closer to my door and stop. I figured that my grandfather was adjusting the thermostat. I opened my door to see what was going on, only to find that everyone in the house was asleep and all the lights were turned off. Needless to say, I didn't sleep well that night. A few weeks passed, and I went over there on a weekend because I had nothing better to do. Since it was a weekend, I stayed up rather late and fell asleep watching TV on my bed with my door open. It was about 1:30 in the morning, and for whatever reason, I woke up without any reason. I look around and realize that I have fallen asleep with the TV on. I looked at my door, and at that instance, I saw a man-sized figure step out of my doorway and walk down the hall towards the kitchen. I slammed my door and stayed up all night. By this time, I was pretty convinced I had a demon, ghost, or something in my grandparents' house. I was just relieved that whatever was in their house wasn't following me. Maybe a month after the last incident happened, I was at my dad's house, and I was about to go to sleep. At my dad's, I'm on the other side of the house from everyone. It was maybe 10:30 at night, and I was about to go to sleep. I had laid down, turned my TV off, and was drifting to sleep. Then outside of my door, I heard a combination of stomping and a really low sound. This honestly scared the hell out of me. I, in all of my infinite wisdom, decided to see what it was. When I opened my door, I saw the same thing that I saw at my grandparents' house. I teared up from fear, left the light on, and fitfully tried to sleep. It didn't work well. Maybe a month and a half had passed since the last incident. I was at a friend's house, and he and I cleaned out a shed so we could just hang out in there and smoke his hookah. He usually has a lot of people over to his house, but this night it was just him and me. We were smoking hookah and were almost finished. We were just listening to some music, and I was just sitting there listening to the music when all of a sudden a black flash darted underneath my legs, but I didn't feel anything. I started to look around to see if one of his cats came in with us. As I started to look around, I realized that there was no cat in the shed. I start to become afraid on the inside, but I try to keep myself outwardly calm. I look up at my friend, who has the look of being close to panic, and all he says to me is, "I think something just ran underneath your legs." At this point, I started freaking out because I didn't say anything about it. He told me that he saw it as well. We both ran out of the shed and went into his house, where we just watched TV until we calmed down and went to sleep. Nothing had happened for many weeks, so I figured it was over. Except it wasn't. One night, I was at a friend's house, and he lives on a dock. We were on his dock one night. He and I were sitting next to each other, and I was looking at the stars, not paying attention to them. All of a sudden, I feel him walk next to me and start walking off the dock towards his house. Without looking, I asked, "Hey man, where are you going?" And he answered me that he was right next to me and hadn't moved. I quickly turned around to see a dark figure walking towards his house. I asked him if he saw anything, and he said, "See what? I thought you got up and started walking up." After I told him what had gone down, we quickly got our stuff and went inside. All was quiet for about 2 months until about a week ago. The same friend and I are rooming together in college, and one night I was sitting there in the dorm by myself. I'm on my laptop, and I'm wearing sweatpants. All of a sudden, I felt something rub against my leg, and when I looked down, I didn't see anything. I was spooked at this point, but I stayed in my seat. About 10 minutes pass, and I start to feel breathing on my leg. I look down and can see my sweatpants moving like they were being breathed on. I was scared shitless, left my dorm, and went to a friend's house. That was about a week ago, and so far nothing new has happened. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. If you didn't like this video, drop a dislike and let me know why down in the comments. I appreciate the support. Thanks for watching. Have a good night.